Hey, good morning. One of my friends saw me online the other week, and he's like, "You're such a Saint Bernard of a man. It's great you got that barrel on your chest." So I don't know what they put on the Saint Bernards. I don't know what that barrel is, but this is a receiver. Like, helps us to record back. About a month ago, I and the wife went out for holiday, and we parked our camper trailer beside a trophy fishing lake. So we had 8 glorious days of fishing non-stop. Probably more glorious for me than for my wife, but she made vows, right? She needs to fulfill them. And I figured when we... I don't know why that gets such a groan. I figured when we got to this lake that nobody would be catching more fish than me, because I'm the best, man. I know how to fish. But even when I wasn't catching anything, there's this one fellow there that was just hammering fish all day long. That's a term that fishermen use to describe catching lots of fish, hammering fish, or other assorted violent terms like punishing them or wailing on them or crushing them. It's strange because it's catch and release, and it's like, World War III out there, and the fish are Nazi zombies, and we need to destroy them before we gently put them back in the water, punish them again later. So this one fellow, anyway, he was crushing fish after fish after fish. He's hauling them in double headers, and I'm looking at it, and I was angry. How dare he catch more fish than me? And so I couldn't help but sidle up my boat next to his and ask him a few questions. What fly are you using? What depth are you fishing at? How are you doing that? Where do you live? Can I be your best friend? And he was actually really nice. He came over and he gave me a couple flies and some tips, like, fish at 40 feet. Don't trust your depth sounder. Test the depth with something on the end of your line. Use a black and purple fly. And I listened to every word that he said. I memorized every muscle twitch on his face. He obviously knew what he was doing, and so I gave his words full authority. Now, how smart would I have been if, he's telling me how it's done, and this is what you do, if I said, well, actually, buddy, you're not the boss of me. I know how it's done. I'm doing it my way. And yet I find that in my journey with Jesus, I do that with him all of the time. Now, on the one hand, when I read about Jesus, I read his teachings and I read about his life, I can see that he knows what he's doing. He knows how to be a human being. When he knows the Father intimately, he draws a lot of power from him. He knows how to love, he knows how to live, he knows how to forgive. In short, he knows how to be free. He knows how to be a free human being. So from what I can tell, Jesus knows what he's doing. And he says that I can be like him if I do what he says. So he says, if you hold to my teaching, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So if you put my teachings into practice, you will be free, like me. But so many times I tell Jesus, Jesus, you might kind of have something figured out there, but you're not the boss of me. I know better than you how to run my life. You know how to run your life, but I think I know better how to do mine. And so I'm going to do it my way. How smart is that? If we want freedom, which is what we're talking about right now, if we want freedom from sin and its debilitating effects, if we want freedom from guilt and insecurity, if we want freedom from addiction and anger and anxiety, if we want freedom to know our Creator intimately and to join in his plan for us and to draw power from him, then we must not just come to Jesus and ask for freedom, but we must start implementing the things he says we need to in order to get that freedom. So we must give him and his words authority in our life. The less authority we give him, the less freedom we'll have. The more authority we give him, the more freedom we will have. So freedom from Jesus is not a magic wand. It is a worldview and a lifestyle. Jesus' worldview and his lifestyle that we are trying to conform to. And this is a big question in the book of Galatians, which we are in right now. How much authority will we give to Jesus? And how much authority will we give to the words written and attributed to him? Specifically, this book, written by the Apostle Paul. Paul's opening words of the letter to the churches in Galatia are these. This letter is from Paul, an apostle. I was not appointed by any group of people or human authority, but by Jesus Christ himself. So right away, Paul knows that what's very important is whether or not we're going to take these words on authority from Jesus Christ. Will we accept that these words are from the resurrected living Lord? Now, giving authority to Jesus isn't easy, is it? Now, first of all, Jesus asks us to do some difficult things, some very difficult things. Second of all, he asks us to accept some beliefs about God and ourselves and the world that are unpopular and might be socially costly for us. So maybe you have some reasons why you struggle, like I do, to give Jesus full authority in your life. Or why you would struggle to give authority to the words of the New Testament as true representations of Jesus and God. Not only are these words difficult to put into practice, but how do we really know that they are from the resurrected Jesus? How do we know that Paul is being honest with us when he says he's got this message directly from the resurrected Jesus? That's a pretty bold claim. How do we know? Do we have any evidence that that is actually true? How do we know that Paul didn't just make all this up, and create a religion so that he could have power over people, so he could have fame, so he could tell people what to do? And it's often said that history is written by the winners. The winners, they're the ones that write history and tell us how it is, and we get a version of truth that's been written by the winners. And furthermore, it's been 2,000 years since these documents were written down. How do we know that they haven't been changed and altered since then? There's copies made. There was original documents. Paul wrote this letter, and then it was copied and distributed, and then there was copies of those copies that were made, and so on and so forth, down to today, where what we have is actually an English version of Greek copies of what Paul originally wrote. How do we know that this is true to what he wrote in the first place? Well, a section of Galatians that we're in today is all about those questions and the question of authority. And Paul's going to give us some answers. In fact, he's going to use rational, historical arguments for why we should give divine authority to his message and the rest of his book. I thought somebody said my name, but it was just Axel calling out. Amen, brother. We can't prove that Christianity is true, but there's some good evidences. Our faith isn't a blind faith, it's a reasonable faith. So there's evidence for it, and our faith goes beyond just what the evidence can do, but it's nice to know that there is evidence underneath. And we're going to explore a little bit of that from Paul's own words in his book today. So let's start at the 11th verse in the first chapter of his letter. Dear brothers and sisters, I want you to understand that the gospel message, the good news message about Jesus that I preach, is not based on mere human reasoning. I received my message from no human source, or merely human source, because we know Jesus is still human, but he's also God. I received my message from no human source, and no one taught me. So we have all heard about Jesus from someone else. So our parents taught us about Jesus, or a Sunday school teacher, or a pastor. We learned the message of Jesus from a person who learned the message of Jesus from someone else, who learned the message of Jesus from someone else. And that message is preserved in the Bible, but it's passed on from person to person to person through history. And we receive that message, when we receive it, on faith. We have some good reasons for believing it, but we go beyond those and we grasp it by faith. But Paul says, that's not how it worked for me. I didn't receive this message on faith. He says this, Instead, I received it by direct revelation from Jesus Christ. So Paul never knew Jesus before Jesus died. But here he's saying, I saw the resurrected, living, human God-man with my own eyes. I saw him, I heard his voice, and he told me the message about him. Bold claim. Maybe you'd say, I want to believe you, Paul. I want to accept that. But why should I? Paul says, I'll give you some reasons why. So we're going to go through these few reasons. The first one is this. The first reason that we should accept why Paul's message in the rest of this book and elsewhere is divine is because the best explanation for his conversion is that Jesus physically appeared to him. Here's his argument. Let's read. You know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion. So Paul's writing to these people who know his personal history. He's saying, you know me. You know my past. And he's also inviting them to fact check. So Paul's story wasn't just known through his own testimony by these churches in Galatia. It's known by a great many other people in Israel and in Jerusalem. So he was quite well known. He was a famous man, and his personal history was known by many. So he's saying, check this out. You don't have to receive it just on my words. You know what I was like when I followed the Jewish religion, how I violently persecuted God's church. I did my best to destroy it. I was far ahead of my fellow Jews in my zeal for the traditions of my ancestors. I want to tell all of Paul's story because Sean has already told that, but I want to follow his argument here. What Paul is saying is that before he met Jesus, he was completely sold out to a very different understanding of who God was than after that conversion. So before, he was a dedicated follower of the Jewish religion, of Judaism. And the Judaism of the first century was all about keeping God's laws. So specifically those laws that are written in the first 5 books of the Bible. The Jews were very rigorous about studying those laws, knowing those laws, and keeping those laws in order that they could be accepted by God. So there were 630 laws, and also additional laws that the rabbis wrote to make sure that you kept the most primary laws. So let's put this fence back a few. And so they had a whole bunch of rules, and that religion at that time was all about keeping those rules. And Paul was sold out to that form of knowing God, keeping the rules. He believed beyond a shadow of a doubt that that is exactly what God wanted. In fact, he was professionally trained to the highest levels of Judaism. So he studied under this famous rabbi named Gamaliel. And as Paul broke away and started his own career as a Pharisee, he himself became famous. And he was starting to be promoted in the Jewish state because of that. So at that time, church and state were melded. And so Paul was getting promoted higher and higher and higher in the Jewish state because of his ardent Judaism. So he was a winner. He was famous. He was in power. He had a lot of power from the state. And so when this cult called Christianity started to rise, he used that power to crush this new cult. So in Paul's mind, Christianity was a perversion of Judaism. Christians said that Jesus fulfilled all the laws for them. So he perfectly obeyed all those 630 laws. And then he went to the cross to die for their sins. And now all they had to do was rely on the grace of God through Jesus Christ. And that made them acceptable to God. That pleased God, just depending on Jesus. To Paul, that was a big, fat lie. So he knew that Jesus was dead. It was over. And nobody was going to get off the hook before God by trusting in Jesus. He knew those people who believed that really believed something false. And at the end of their lives, they were going to be they're going to stand before God and be judged for what they did not do. So this faith was a lie. And Paul used his power to stamp it out. So he arrested, he imprisoned, he killed Christians so that this lie could end. And it was while he was on a trip from Jerusalem to Damascus with an entourage of other Jews around him on a mission to root out more Christians in the city of Damascus that all of that changed in a single moment. He says this, "But even before I was born, unbeknownst to me, God chose me and called me by His marvelous grace. Then, on that trip to Damascus, it pleased God to reveal His Son to me so that I could proclaim the good news about Jesus to the Gentiles." So this is Paul's reason for why we should believe that Jesus gave him his message directly. He's saying, fact check this. You know my story. I was sold out to God and His law. And for that reason, I was sold out to persecuting and destroying Christians and Christianity. I was winning at it. I had a lot of power. I was famous. I was writing history. I had a lot of national credibility. I was famous. I had friends in high places. I had a career that was taking off. All because I was anti-Jesus. But in a moment, I did a 180-degree turn and I joined the losing team. So not over the course of years, not over the course of months or weeks or even days. Paul says, in one single moment, on one day, I became one of the losers. I became a Christian. I gave up my convictions about God. I gave up my career. I willingly lost my friends and my credibility, and I compromised my future, and I became a passionate Jesus follower, willing to suffer and die for this message, which he did. So what is the one event that could have brought about such a cataclysmic shift in Paul? A nice chat with a good Christian? Reading a book that convinced him? No. Only the appearance in the middle of the road of the living, resurrected Christ Himself. Paul says only the living Christ could have changed my mind. So he says that's what happened. It's the only thing that explains my story. Check it out. Doesn't make any sense unless Jesus actually appeared to me. I find that to be a decent argument from the historical facts. Maybe not one that's going to convince all the skeptics and blow everybody right out of the water. But how else will we explain what happened to Paul? Why would he make such a shift? Was he in a trance? Was he on LSD? And he had a hallucination about Jesus? The only problem with that is that there were other people there, and they also witnessed something going on. They sensed a presence speaking to him, and they could confirm that. So it wasn't just Paul, but others with him. That's his first piece of evidence. His second one is this. Paul's message about Jesus came independent from the Jerusalem apostles. So he got his message independent from the people who knew Jesus before he died. So some people in Galatia were claiming, Paul didn't have this direct revelation. He didn't have this, big vision or encounter with Christ. He was actually trained in Jerusalem. So he knew the disciples there that knew Jesus, and they told him about him, and he went out and shared that message, but he got it wrong. He actually alter it, and so we need to correct what he's saying. Here's Paul's counter-argument to that. When this happened, so when Jesus appeared to me, I did not rush out to consult with any human being, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to consult with those who were apostles before I was. Instead, I went into Arabia, and later I returned to the city of Damascus. So Paul says, I didn't know Peter, I didn't know John, I didn't know Thomas, I didn't know any of those guys. When I became a Christian, I had never met them, never heard the message about Jesus from them. Nor did I instantly go to meet them. Now, if I was Paul and I had this encounter with Christ on the road, I'd probably turn my chariot around, I'd go back to Jerusalem, and I'd talk to the guys that lived with Jesus for 3 years. I'd be like, I want to know more about him. Teach me about him. I want to teach about him to others, so why don't I fill out my teaching by hearing from you guys? But not Paul. Jesus' presence in that moment where he met him and the message that he received were so powerful and compelling and sufficient that he turned aside immediately and he went into Arabia and Syria for 3 years. And some people think that, maybe he went and he was preparing and he was praying hard for 3 years before he was going to blast out on his missionary career. But if we look at what happened in Damascus and what's written about Paul in Acts, we see that he immediately started preaching the gospel. So he went into Arabia and Damascus on a missionary trip right after this encounter with Christ. So this is Paul's second argument for why you should believe that his gospel is from the resurrected Christ. He preached the gospel for 3 years confidently with no training from the people who were in the know. A simple explanation for why he could have done that would be that Jesus appeared to him and told him what the message was. On its own, maybe that argument wouldn't, again, convince everybody, but it's another piece of evidence. Third argument for why we should believe that Paul's gospel is from the living, resurrected Lord. When Paul eventually did meet those other guys, those other apostles in Jerusalem, their message about Jesus synced up perfectly with his. Let's read. 3 years later, so this is after my missionary trip, I went to Jerusalem to get to know Peter, and I stayed with him for 15 days. The only other apostle I met at that time was James, the Lord's brother. I declare before God that what I am writing to you is not a lie. Again, he's saying you can fact check this out. Make sure that this isn't just me. After that visit, I went north into the provinces of Syria and Cilicia, and still the churches in Christ that are in Judea didn't know me personally. I had very limited contact. All they knew was that people were saying, the one who used to persecute us is now preaching the very faith he tried to destroy. And they praised God because of me. And he says into the second chapter, and the leaders of the church had nothing to add to what I was preaching. Instead, they saw that God had given me the responsibility of preaching the gospel to the Gentiles, just as he had given Peter the responsibility of preaching to the Jews. So Paul says, not only did I not learn the message about Jesus from the other guys who knew him, but when I did meet them, our messages were exactly the same. So we're all aware of what happens historically with religions. They start somewhere and then they branch off, and there's all these other different denominations and sects and everything that say different things about the original source. But Christianity actually began from 2 different places. So it began with Paul, and he went out and spread that into Asia. And it began with the Jerusalem apostles. They never met one another, but when they came together, their messages were the same. So what's the odds that they would be exactly the same? And the leaders in Jerusalem would say, wow, you're preaching the exact same thing that we're preaching. Makes me cry. What is the simplest explanation for why that happened? The same Jesus appeared to both groups of people and told them the exact same thing. So let's bring Paul's argument together. 3 reasons why we should accept the book of Galatians and Paul's gospel message about Jesus as coming from the living Christ, because the only event that explains Paul's conversion is that he actually met Jesus. Second, Paul preached the gospel for 3 years without being taught anything from those who knew Jesus before he died. And when he eventually did meet those people, they were saying the exact same thing. So each of these arguments has some merit on its own, but when you bring them together, it's fairly compelling. It's a decent argument for us to believe what Paul is saying about where he got this message. And when we combine that with all the other testimony in the New Testament from all the other apostles for why you should believe that they knew the resurrected Lord, it becomes even more compelling. We don't have time to go through all of that right now. There's this principle of logic that philosophers use, and it's called Occam's razor. And it says that when you're trying to explain something that you can explain in different ways, when you're trying to come up with a theory to explain something that happened, simpler solutions are better than complex ones. So usually a simpler solution is closer to the truth of what happened than a complex explanation. So we could come up with some other theories for where Paul got this message from and where all the other apostles got their message from. So we could say, well, they all had separate hallucinations, and they saw Jesus. They really wanted to. It was their hope, and they desired it so bad that they dreamed it up. Got a bit of a problem with that because all their messages were exactly the same. We could say that they had a conspiracy, that Paul met with these guys, and they had a conspiracy to control people so they could get fame and power and money and riches, and they dug up Jesus' body, they exhumed it, and they paraded it around the streets, and so Jesus wasn't resurrected, it was just a dead body that they showed around. We got some problems with that too, because they didn't get fame and power and success, they got poverty and hate and death. So the people that tried to come up with other explanations for what happened with these guys and the spread of Christianity have to work pretty hard. They have to do some pretty complex historical gymnastics to explain what actually happened. The simplest explanation, and therefore the best one, is that Jesus rose from the dead and met with these guys and told them what to preach. And I find that encouraging, and I hope that you do too, to know that our faith is not a blind one, that it has good historical evidence for it. And so I hope that as we go through the rest of the book of Galatians, you can give it the weight that it deserves, that you can start handing over some of the authority that you've kept to yourself to Jesus and to the message that's written about him in this book. If we second guess it, if we doubt it, then it's going to be harder for us to hand that authority over. But Paul wants to help us and give us good intellectual reasons along with the emotional ones for why we should hand over authority to Jesus so that we can get more freedom from him. And as we test him that way, as we obey Jesus, we'll find that we have another confirmation. We become more free like he is. Amongst the questions that I brought up at the beginning of the sermon, you may have noticed I didn't address one, and that is, how do we know that the words that we have today from Paul are the same as the original ones? And I hear people bring this up all the time. It's like, well, there's copies. It's all messed up, and we don't even know if it's the same as the original. So I wanted to show you a quick clip from a scholar for some of the evidence to show that the New Testament documents that we have today are same as the original ones that were written. So this is taken from the Alpha series, and it's about 5 minutes long. We'll watch that, and then the worship team can come up and lead us in song.
Jesus of Nazareth is believed to have walked these streets around 2,000 years ago. But is there any evidence that he even existed?
Well, there's actually quite a lot of evidence. No serious historian would deny that Jesus existed. The Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius wrote about Jesus, as did the first century Jewish historian Josephus. He described him as Jesus, a doer of wonderful works, and then he goes on to describe his crucifixion and alleged resurrection.
So there's evidence outside of the New Testament for the existence of Jesus, but most of the evidence comes from within inside the New Testament. And sometimes people say, well, the New Testament was written such a long time ago. How do we know what was written down hasn't been changed over the years? Well, the answer is that we do know, because of a science called textual criticism.
Textual criticism examines the number of copies of early texts that we have available to us today, and it looks at the time gap between the original document and the earliest copy that we have. And basically, the more manuscripts we have and the earlier they are, the less doubt there's going to be about the original. So let's compare the Bible to other texts in ancient history, ones that are widely used in schools and universities. Let's look at the Greek historians Herodotus and Thucydides. They both wrote in the 5th century BC. But the earliest copy of their writings that we have dates from AD 900, and that makes a 1300-year time lapse. And even then, we only have 8 copies of these manuscripts in the first place. Or look at the Roman historian Tacitus. There's a 1,000-year gap between his book being written and our first manuscript, and we only have 20 copies. Or another classic, Caesar's Gallic War, 950 years between the book being written and our first manuscript copy. And even then, we only have 9 or 10 copies of these manuscripts. Again, with Livy's famous History of Rome, a 900-year gap between the book being written and our first manuscript, and we only have 20 copies of this. But when it comes to the New Testament, well, it's very different. The New Testament was written between about 40 and 100 AD, and we have manuscript evidence going back as early as 130 AD, and full manuscripts by 350 AD. And we have more than 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin translations, and 9,300 others. So, we can be pretty confident in the accuracy, the authenticity, and the integrity of the New Testament scriptures that have been passed down to us today. The remarkable thing about the Bible is there's such a short chronological distance between the events being described and our first manuscripts. So in many ways, the Bible scholars are in a very fortunate position of being able to check these things out and finding that they are much more reliable than, for example, some of the alternatives you're looking at. And as a scholar, I am more than happy to say, I trust this, I take it very, very seriously, I rely on it.